Hi, I'm John Moore. I'm the carpentry instructor and the program coordinator for the construction technology program here at West Kentucky Community and Technical College. And today we're going to be talking about moldings, installing moldings, and some of the problems you might encounter and some of those solutions that we use to make the job easier, more efficient, and to end up with a product that you can be proud of. In a minute here, we'll show you some examples of moldings, different applications, and then some of the techniques that we use to cut them and place them. One of the most challenging parts of installing any molding is having to deal with the corners. We first teach our beginning students how to accurately measure. It's very important, but it's a little more difficult and usually reserved for a carpenter who is a little more experienced to install those moldings. However, with a little practice, it's not too difficult to learn how to do it properly. So we have certain techniques that we use to make that job easier, and so that you end up with a product that's acceptable. Most carpenters today, when they're working, are going to have a power miter saw that they can use, and this has really revolutionized a lot of the building industry. It's enabled us to make cuts that are very accurate, quickly, efficiently, better than the old hand miter box. But even with all the advances in technology, with all the modern tools that we have, and we have a wonderful shop here, table saws, band saws, miter saws, many people find that they still get frustrated when they're trying particularly to install an inside corner. It's still very difficult to get those joints to fit tightly, because many times the surfaces that we're dealing with are not perfect surfaces. We have a board here that we mock up, that we actually use when we're testing our students on some of these techniques. It's nice and square, all the surfaces are flat and even, and they could very easily take the pieces that they've practiced and cut and put on our board here to check the accuracy of their cuts. But in the real world, when you're working on a home, even if it's a brand new home, many times those inside corners are not just perfect. You have to deal with sheetrock, mud that might not be perfectly level or slightly rounded off. And you'll find quickly that when you use the miter saw to cut that inside corner, it just doesn't quite fit properly. People really get frustrated over that. Many years ago, I say many years ago, when I first started in the building industry, and it's more years ago than I'd like to recall, I noticed, I had an opportunity to work on a lot of older residences, and I noticed that as I was disassembling some of these molding assemblies, that they were put together in a certain way, and it looks very difficult. And I was curious about why it was done that way. But they use, for their inside corners, a technique that is called coping. And for that technique, they use the coping saw. If you've never used one, or if you had seen them and wondered what they were used for other than cutting out jigsaw puzzles, it is called a coping saw, and it is used for coping moldings. A coped joint on an inside corner is basically a series of moldings that are put together, one piece square and the other piece cut at the profile of that molding, so that when it fits together, it gives the illusion of a fairly accurate mitered joint. You might ask why they would go to the trouble of making a joint like that. it's actually, once you master this technique, it's an actually much more forgiving joint. You're able to place your moldings on surfaces that aren't absolutely perfect and still get the same desired result. Now we use our power miter saws with these coping saws to get that nice, accurate, clean, crisp line. And in just a minute here, we'll see if we can set up some of these problems and show you exactly the process that we go through to make this all work. A minute ago we were talking about the problems that you might encounter when installing moldings, and I did mention that it doesn't matter how new or how old the house is, we never have a perfect surface, an absolutely perfect surface to go to. That same thing holds true with the lumber that we're using and the moldings that we're using, particularly anything that has any width to it more than 2 or 3 inches. A lot of times the boards will have a little cup to them or a little warp, and as carefully as we can cut this on the miter saw, when I put this molding up tight against that regular surface, very difficult to get that to fit just perfect all the way around. So we can wiggle this around and spend some time to make that look right, and of course that's just fine. But if we use this, this technique of coping our moldings, we have a way to kind of get around some of these problems that you would encounter when you're doing particularly an inside quarter and using a miter box, a powered miter box, hand miter box, whatever. So I'm going to show you here how we begin to build a molding. After we've measured our room and we've made sure that our measurements are accurate and we've cut our pieces of wood, we can start installing our moldings. And the baseboard that we're going to mimic today is going to be a composite baseboard. It's a baseboard that's made out of a couple of different parts. You can certainly go to the lumber yard and buy a baseboard that has the molding already incorporated, but for larger profile moldings, they're often made out of several different pieces. We start with the baseboard itself, and when we're measuring, actually we're simplifying our cutting and installation of this molding, because all we have to do on this baseboard is measure carefully and make square cuts. So when we get one board in, we can take the other board, measure that distance, and put it up against that board, and as long as our cuts are square, we can make that fit really nicely. That's almost seamless there. The second component to this composite baseboard is what's called the base cap. And the base cap is just a little decorative molding that fits on top of the base. You can see that on the first piece that we measure and cut, we can cut it square and put it right up against the adjacent wall surface. That means that somehow we have to have a technique or a method for cutting the profile out of this other base cap and fitting it to the square cut piece. And when we get it together, I'll try to get my hand out of the way. When we get it together, it fits nice and tightly, and it mimics that mitered cut. You'd be very hard pressed to tell the difference between that and a mitered cut on a table saw. One of the advantages of this molding is that it is a little more forgiving. And if the wall is slightly out of square, you can still move this molding one way or the other, and that joint will still stay fairly tight. Whereas with a miter cut, that 45-degree angle is established, And if you move that slightly one way or the other, it's going to tend to open or close at the top, the bottom, the middle. And that's a really, really frequent frustration for people who are installing their moldings. I just can't do this. I can't make it cut. How did you cut that and make it look like it fits so tight? So this is one of the tricks that carpenters really over the last several centuries, and sometimes you can find examples of this that even predate that. These are the solutions that they came up with many, many years ago, and they're still valid today. A lot of the things that we teach in the program, although we love having these nice tools, and we're pretty spoiled by using all of these nice modern tools, many of those tools are based on tools that have been around for centuries and many times thousands of years. They're still valid. They still hold water, so to speak. The last component of our baseboard is the base shoe. And again, the same way we've cut the baseboard and the cap, that first piece is cut square, put tight to the adjacent surface, and then, I don't know if you can see this closely enough or not, but the profile has also been cut out of the base shoe. And when we put that in the corner, again, you'd be hard-pressed to tell that that wasn't a mitered cut. It looks kind of scary as far as how do you do that? How do you do that and get such nice, clean lines? And in the next segment, what we'll do is start to demystify this, and I'll show you how we set this up, how we make our preliminary cut using our nice, modern, very accurate power miter saw. And then we're going to go back and use some of these older, more traditional tools that for many trim carpenters is still a very important part of their toolbox. We'll be using the miter saw. Of course, we've got our candy tape measure here, a pencil, a nice sharp knife. It could be a utility knife. And really, that's about it. So let's talk a little bit about the process. How do we start making these cuts, and where do we begin, basically? The baseboard part is fairly simple. As I said before, it's just basically a square cut. When we're teaching our students this technique, we're not going to ask them to cut a very complex profile. When practicing this technique, it's very good to start out with a very simple profile. Once you've mastered that, then you can move on and maybe try to attempt to do a molding that's a little more complex in its shape and in its size. We usually start out with what's called a base shoe. It's very similar to a quarter round, but it's actually about 3/4 of an inch high and just a 1/2 of an inch deep. And it's used quite often at the bottoms of baseboard, and it helps transition from the wall to whatever floor surface you have down on your floor. The first thing we want to do is make sure that we have our measurements accurate. And when we're cutting coped moldings, of course you'll have to imagine that there's another corner over here, but we really drill our students on being accurate on their measurement. Once we get that measurement, another thing I like to tell my students is don't worry about if it's too long. You can always make it shorter, but if you cut it too short, it's really hard to make it longer again. And many times when you're installing cope moldings, it is nice to have that extra 1/16 of an inch, particularly on a long molding. Just a little long, because as you put that molding in, it's going to fit really nice and tightly into that corner. So how do we do this? Do we just kind of guess what that profile is? Well, no. I mean, you could do it trial and error, but I have another piece of molding here, and I'm going to go on over to the saw and show you how we begin. First of all, we have to determine what the length of that molding is, and after we've taken our measurement, we're going to make a mark on that molding at the top of the molding, again, as accurately as we can get it. And you'll have to imagine that I've measured to the other side of the room, but I think that for demonstration purposes, this is going to be fine. We'll take this on over to the saw now, I guess, and show how this is done. Before we get started using the saw, I just want to say a little bit about safety. We're very particular about safety here in the shop with all of our students. We have safety training and we have written safety policies that the students are expected to follow. You can imagine that with all of these tools here, the potential for hurting yourself is pretty big. So I've got my safety glasses on. They're a nuisance sometimes, but they're a necessary part of what we do here in the shop. We've determined what length this molding is going to be. I've put my little mark here, and of course this is an imaginary mark. But after we've measured our molding from wall to wall, we've put a mark on here and we know where we want to cut this. The first step in doing an accurate coped cut is to establish that 45-degree angle. And we can do that very quickly and very accurately using our power miter saw. So I'm going to go ahead and set this up. These miter saws, generally the modern ones will have positive stops at the most commonly used angles that we use in construction. This power miter saw, as long as we keep our stock tightly and firmly to the base and to the back fence here, is really a pretty safe tool to use. Of course, you want to keep your fingers away from the business end of the saw blade, but it's going to be a process of lining your saw up to your mark. And there is a process of learning your tool. You have to know your tool, know the limits of where that saw blade is going to cut. Many times for beginning students, I encourage them to cut just a little bit large, and when they see where that blade comes into that molding, they can micro adjust and move that piece of wood to the blade so that it's cutting accurately. And I'll show that here just a little bit if I can. I can see that I'm just a little long of that mark. That's a good thing, because I know I can always make it shorter if I take the piece and move it just slightly closer to that blade. I can be pretty confident that I'm going to get an accurate cut. So I've cut pretty closely to my line. I now have a miter cut on that, and we are turning a 90-degree corner, and half of that 90 degrees happens to be 45 degrees. So that's where we start. Now on this piece of wood, we're going to do something here that's going to make us a little easier to follow that line, because the process of coping is going to require that I cut out all of this mitered surface and leave the face of the material still showing. And it has to be done accurately. One of the things that we do to make this a little easier is we can take a pencil, a little easier to follow, and just kind of rub the edge of that pencil on that profile that was exposed there on our 45-degree angle. Then I'm going to go ahead and move on over to the table and show you how we start our coped cut. Many times I'll have the students help each other, have one student help support the piece, because it is important to have your work pieces firmly in place before you start any kind of cutting operation. I think I can probably do this by myself. We're going to start the saw, the coping saw, and imagine an angle that will cut through that profile there and take out enough material that the only thing that's touching the piece of molding next to it is that sharp edge. I'm going to have to reposition my piece of wood as I go around the corner. Now, I can't hope to get that perfect on that little narrow piece, but that doesn't really matter because every carpenter has a utility knife or a sharp pocket knife, and at this point we can use that to just kind of peel this down to a nice sharp point. And I think that we'll be pretty happy with the result that we have here when we fit that piece into place. Simple, right? Some of the things that you have to keep in mind are that you have to make sure that you have enough of that material cut out so that the two surfaces fit tightly together. And it requires, I don't know if you can see this or not, but it requires that when you start your cut, you do a little bit of back cutting on that, what we call back cutting, so that the only surface that's touching the edge is right here. It takes a little practice to get this down, but so many of my students are really amazed at how quickly they can learn to do a simple cope joint like this. And it's really nice to see the smiles on their faces sometimes when they've accomplished a really good, acceptable cope joint. Something that seems so mysterious and maybe so hard, all of a sudden is within their grasp. We're going to talk a little bit now about crown moldings because we have another set of problems to deal with when we're dealing with crown moldings. We're still going to be talking about coping the inside corners, but we have a whole different set of problems with crown molding that we'll talk about here in just a little bit. Okay, so let's continue. We saw how easy it was, comparatively, to cut that real simple cope on that base shoe. As you get more skilled with these techniques, we can move on into cutting more complex profiles. This is a really common crown molding profile, and of course, in my testing jig, we have it set upside down. It just so happens that when you cut crown moldings, you're also cutting them upside down. So one of the problems that you encounter when installing crown moldings, and you're looking up there where that crown molding is supposed to go, is that when you're using your saw, particularly a power miter saw, you're going to have to orient that upside down and backwards, basically. You can see that when I take this over to the saw, the proper position for cutting this is in the position that it would be on the wall, but of course upside down. There are some other complications in cutting the crown molding as well, and that it's not a solid piece of wood. I hope you can see this okay, but where it meets the wall and the ceiling, behind that could be a sizable gap. So it's very important that when you cut your crown molding, that you know exactly how far down the wall it's going to extend and how far out on the ceiling it extends from the wall, because that's how you're going to set that up on your saw. If this is off just a little bit, one way or the other, you see it becomes problematic. But as long as we have those constant, and as long as we know where those points are on the wall, we can mimic those points on our saw. In some cases, even use a stop on base of the saw to keep the crown molding in place while we cut that initial 45-degree angle. These crown moldings are very common. They have several different profiles, and you can see that it gets pretty tricky to get these all cut out. Make sure that they're all back cut properly and that they fit tightly. A little practice and you can get pretty good at it in a relatively short time. One of the things that we do to help us to cut this is that we have to be also mindful when we cut this crown molding. It's nice to have it positioned at the angle that the crown molding is actually installed on, because it's really hard to visualize our vertical and horizontal planes just if this is laying flat on the ground. It'd be really difficult to set our saw up so that we could be cutting in those proper planes. So I've built a very simple jig here that holds the crown molding at the angle that it would be in the wall or on the wall as we install it. And it enables me to visualize the plane and the direction that that other crown molding is going to be coming at to be able to fit up against it. And it makes me much more able to eyeball and to guess and make sure I get a little bit of back cut in there so that I have a nice, clean, sharp edge. We do basically the same thing. We cut it first on the saw, get that nice 45-degree angle. We'll take our pencil, inscribe that edge, and then we'll make our cut. That's it. If you'd like to learn a little bit more about carpentry, we have some wonderful programs here and some wonderful classes in carpentry at the school. I've got some really eager students this semester and really having a good time working with them. I'm going to go ahead and I've got one of these already cut, so I'm going to go ahead and cut one of these moldings. Let me get a little idea of how this works. Take my pencil, get that edge on there. Some of this stuff out of the way. Cut these straight edges first. And work my profiles in.